Thank you very much.
Good morning, Chair. We'll now be hearing from Darren Thompson.
Thank you, Ms Livingston.
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly, declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can you give us your full name, please?
It's Darren Thompson.
Thank you. And Mr. Thompson, you gave a statement to the inquiry. That's our reference INN 000024. Chair, if I can ask for that statement to be adduced in full.
Indeed, thank you.
And Mr. Thompson, what that means is that the whole statement is in evidence before the inquiry, so that I don't have to take you through every line and every word of that statement. Just to start with some issues about the background and recruitment, you worked at Brook House from about January 2015 till January 2018, is that right?
That's right.
And you were a DCO for most of it, but you acted up as a DCM from about August 2017, is that right?
That's right.
And then were you acting DCM until you left?
That's right.
Okay. And in your witness statement, paragraph 4, you say that you were attracted to the DCO role because you wanted to work with people and it sounded interesting, and you say you enjoyed it when you first started. Did that change?
Slowly, progressively, as you work there at the centre.
You began to enjoy it less?
As I got further on into working in the centre, yeah.
And why was that?
It's just because the environment eventually just sort of like wears you down in the end.
Okay, well, we'll come on to that in a bit more detail in due course. You say somewhere in the middle of your statement at paragraph 50 that the training you received before starting allowed you to do the job but didn't prepare you for how to cope with the day-to-day at Brook House, is that right?
That's right.
And what's the difference between that? Is it that it allowed you to do each task but it didn't prepare you to cope?
I don't think it sort of prepared you for dealing with the detainees on a day-to-day basis and everything that was kind of involved within working in the centre.
Thinking back, and I know that it's a while ago now, to the training that you received, do you think it painted an overly positive picture of life at Brook House?
I don't know.
Sorry?
Sorry, I don't know.
You don't know? Well, I mean, given what the training was like and what it was actually like at Brook House, did those things, were they the same?
In that case, I think it was slightly different, yeah.
Okay. In what way?
Just where the training kind of like prepared you for your sort of DCO role, I think. But as I say, when it comes to sort of like the day-to-day working and working with detainees, it was I don't think we had sort of any training with the detainees as such.
Okay.
So it'd be nice if we could have spent had a bit of time and learning about them.
Did you do any shadowing as part of your training?
I think the shadowing was like the last 2 weeks. I think it was just after the training had finished.
Okay. And you also say in your statement that when you were seconded into the DCM role, so in August 2017, you don't feel that you received adequate training or time to prepare for that at that stage. Is that right?
Yes.
And did you receive any training on how to be a DCM at all?
No sort of formal training. It was sort of shadowing a fellow detention centre manager and observing and watching their role and how they did their job.
And becoming a DCM, did that give you line management responsibility for anyone?
I can't remember. I think it did, yeah. I think it did.
Any idea roughly how many people you were line manager to?
I can't really remember. Maybe two or three.
Okay, so it's not 15 or 20 or anything like that.
No.
A few people. Okay, and do you recall who was involved in the decision that you be seconded into the DCM role?
I believe it was Steve Skitt interviewed me.
And was it an application process? So did you actually apply to be seconded, or were you asked?
Yes.
Okay. Were you told that you should apply, or did you just decide to apply?
I think I think the role come up, and you were sort of like, it might be an idea for you to consider applying, or something like that. And I thought it would be a good step for myself. And
then you were interviewed by Steve Skitt, which you say in your statement, and you got the role as acting DCM, and acting sounds a bit like it was a sort of temporary thing. Is that what you were told?
That's right, it was, yeah.
Okay. For how long were you told?
I didn't know. I wasn't, it was just as long as perhaps they needed me, and then I would maybe return to become to a DCO role again.
Okay. And do you have any idea why you were being recruited as an acting DCM as opposed to just a DCM?
I don't.
Okay. I want to ask you a few questions about your role as a DCO. First. You talk in your statement about the work you do as a DCO and say that you enjoyed being in an environment with people around, and you describe at paragraph 8 of your statement that your role as you saw it was to help detainees. Is that right?
That's right.
Do you think that's how your colleagues saw it as well?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay. And do you think that's how the detainees saw it, that your role was to help them?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
One of the things you say in your statement at paragraph 22 is that people were kept on B wing, which I believe was the induction wing, for a couple of weeks because a decision had been made from management that they were going to stay on that wing for a couple of weeks. Is that right?
Wouldn't normally be for a couple of weeks. Usually, detainees, when they arrived on the induction wing, it should normally only be for a couple of days maximum, and then they should be moved off the induction wing to a residential wing. Yeah. So you say at paragraph 22 that, for example, someone who had a charter flight in 2 weeks was being kept on B wing until that flight, and you say it shouldn't have happened, but it did. Do you know why people were staying on the wing for 2 weeks? I think at the end it was probably just it was a managerial decision to house a detainee on the induction wing until their charter. It may be because of not having enough rooms, and they might have been single occupants, so they would maybe require a room to themselves. And what were the consequences of someone being on B wing for that amount of time rather than moving to one of the residential wings? There's no consequences. It was just the fact that there was a room being taken up by somebody that was awaiting a charter flight, when instead perhaps it should have been used for new detainees arriving. So presumably the consequence could be that people who were due to be on the induction wing then couldn't stay in the induction wing because there was already someone in. Because there was already someone in the room. Okay. Yeah. Do you remember who would make the decisions about how long people should stay? I don't. Okay. I wanted to ask about the atmosphere at Brook House. Paragraph 10 of your statement, you describe an intimidating and aggressive atmosphere at Brook House. And then you go on to talk about detainees getting angry and aggressive and threatening staff and other detainees. Do you think that staff contributed to that aggressive atmosphere as well, or did you think it was just detainees? I don't think that's something that I saw when I was there. Did you? So you thought it was that aggression was just coming from one side? It would appear to look like that. Yeah. One of the things you say at paragraph 14 of your statement, Mr. Thompson, is that staff needed to show that they were willing to stand up to behaviour that was wrong. What does stand up mean to you? Sort of dealing with abusive and aggressive behaviour, and sort of being able to show that you're there willing to deal with the situation, and to provide a point where a detainee can see that you're actually trying to do your job and sort of protect others whilst you're dealing with certain situations. But I mean, in practical terms, does that mean sort of not backing down? Does it mean not walking away? Does it mean not giving in to requests? What does it mean in practice? Not all the time. Sometimes you have to stand your ground, or you de-escalate the situation by talking to the detainee. You always try and de-escalate the situation as best as you can. Did you think that was something that set you apart from some of your colleagues, that you were willing to stand up and that others weren't? Quite possibly. I can only sort of look at how I worked with my colleagues on the wing, and I don't sort of recollect how others used to work on the other wings. But even on your wing, for example, did you experience that there were some colleagues who you felt weren't standing their ground? Yeah. Okay, and what were the consequences of that? We just ended up having to deal with those situations even more. So it was sort of kind of looks like it's falling back on you all the time to sort of like deal with confrontation and issues like that at the time.
Okay. One of the things you say, Mr. Thompson, is that you received verbal abuse, threats, intimidation, and violence, and you say that it became a very difficult place to work, Brook House. Do you think that generally you responded appropriately to this behaviour?
I think generally, yeah.
Do you think you always did?
Not always.
Okay, well maybe we'll come back to some of those situations in a bit. Is there anything that comes to mind for you as to situations where you didn't respond appropriately?
Well, there's going to be some situations that you kind of look at later.
Okay, well if I don't mention any of them, then perhaps, or any that you're thinking of, then perhaps you can tell us in due course. Do you think that, again, I know that you can only tell us about what you experienced around you, but did you find that you were receiving more abuse or threats from detainees than other staff, or did you think it was shared pretty equally?
I suppose when I look back, I think I was probably getting more than my fair share than what others maybe were receiving.
And any thoughts about why?
Because I wanted to follow the centre rules and stand there and, if you're controlling the door, for example, if you're not allowed to come onto the wing, trying to maintain that control and security for the wing and for the detainees that are on there. So I just found that I was sort of consistently dealing with a lot of confrontation and verbal abuse and intimidation, sort of on almost a daily basis.
And so that example there about letting people go on to other wings,
yeah.
Is that a scenario where you felt that you were keeping to the rules by
Yeah.
saying, no, you're not allowed to go on to this other wing,
Yeah.
whereas other colleagues might just take another route and just say, yeah, fine, go on?
Yeah.
And you saw other colleagues doing that?
I've seen where detainees have been allowed on, well, I say allowed, they've entered the wing without sort of being challenged about why they're coming onto the wing.
And why weren't detainees allowed to go on to other wings?
It was just one of the rules where you're not allowed to go from, to move from one wing onto another wing. They all had ID cards. And I was just following the centre rules and enforcing that.
So was it never explained to you as to why that was necessary? Because obviously, Mr. Thompson, these aren't prisoners. They're people that are being detained under immigration rules. Were you ever told about why they weren't allowed to move?
I don't remember, no.
Okay. You say in your statement that at paragraph 42 that having a detention centre that looks and runs like a prison doesn't leave detainees feeling too comfortable, and that new detainees were concerned arriving into Brook House. Was there anything you could do as a DCO to reassure them when they arrived?
You're speaking to them and just reassuring them that you're there to sort of deal with your case and to get your immigration case sorted out, and if you needed any help, and we were there to assist you, and to try and deal with your case as swiftly and as quickly as possible.
So you felt that you told them that you would be able to assist them with issues with their immigration cases?
Not with their immigration cases. If they needed any help in, say, wanting to speak to Home Office or filling out forms on the wing, that type of thing. Assisting them in those sort of ways, yeah.
And is that what you saw the purpose of people being at Brook House was? They were there to sort out their immigration cases, essentially?
For me to get their, they were being detained because something had happened with their immigration status, and they were there to get it fixed and to rectify it. So.
Okay. One of the things, the quotes you give in your statement at paragraph 44, you say because it was a prison building, people behaved like they were in prison. Did that include staff and detainees?
Can't really answer about the staff, but I think with some of the detainees, I think a lot of detainees, they arrived at Brook House, and perhaps a lot of detainees had come from like a prison environment, which I believe is probably a lot harsher. So it just seemed that it was a more sort of a challenging environment when you're dealing with people that have moved from a prison environment into the detention centre environment.
What does behaving like they're in prison mean, though?
It's just the attitude and the way they behave just seemed some people were a lot more aggressive.
Okay. Coming on to the issue of staff culture, You say in your statement that the overall culture was volatile, aggressive, pressurised, intense, and you say that morale among staff could alter day to day. What would change the morale?
Of the staff morale.
Yeah.
I think it would just depend on how their working day had been and how they were feeling in themselves.
We've heard from some other witnesses talking about Brook House as a place where morale was absolutely shot and staff morale was, at the very bottom. Was that not your experience?
Yeah, I'd say that there was probably staff there that had low morale. There's probably other staff there that sort of can just get on with it and get through the day, no problem at all.
So it wasn't uniform amongst the staff.
I don't think it was uniform, no.
Okay. You say, Mr. Thompson, at paragraph 34 of your statement that you were surprised by some of the things you saw on Panorama, as you didn't see anything like that when you were working at Brook House. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you say that you do not recall seeing mistreatment and it would surprise you if it was going on. But we know from Panorama that mistreatment was going on, yeah?
Mm.
So why do you think you didn't see it?
I just didn't see it.
Have you thought about, you were there for 3 years.
Yeah.
You were there the whole time that Callum Tully was filming. And have you got any, you've probably thought about it when you saw Panorama. Yeah. Did you come to any view as to how you didn't see it or why you didn't see it?
No. I've just spent most of my time working either on one wing or another. I wasn't sort of working effectively around the centre every day, but I just didn't see anything like that going on.
So just coincidence, would you say, that mistreatment was going on and you didn't see any of it?
I didn't see it.
Did you hear about it at all?
No, not as far as I'm aware.
You say in your statement that Brook House was not how it was shown on Panorama. In what way?
Just that you just sort of like see only like snippets on the Panorama sort of programme. But I think in general, day to day, it was a lot more sort of intimidating and sort of an aggressive environment, quite pressurised and tense.
So you think it was more aggressive and pressurised and tense than it was shown on Panorama?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
In terms of coming to like some of the behaviours and the verbal sort of stuff that you tend to deal with the detainees, yeah.
So you were saying that it didn't show the detainees being aggressive towards the staff. It only showed the other way around.
From what I could see on the programme, yeah.
And that didn't reflect your experience of Brook House?
No.
Okay. Just a couple of issues about management. You say at paragraph 39 of your statement that you think staff were given support from the senior management team and that the SMT, that the senior management team, would visit the wing and spend 5 to 10 minutes there each day. Is that right?
Yeah, they'd come down to visit you on the wing.
And every day?
I can't remember if it was every day. I think it was most days.
Okay. And who are we talking about here from the senior management team?
I would imagine it would just be whoever the on-call senior
the
manager,
duty director
would be at the time.
So people like Steve Sketts, Michelle Brown, even would Ben Saunders, would he be there?
I think he's come down once or twice.
Okay. So we've heard from some witnesses that they had no interaction with members of the senior management team, but that wasn't your experience. Is that right?
Yeah, no, they used to come down and speak to you, and you'd speak with them, yeah.
And you say that at paragraph 68, you say that they were available throughout the day and were on call, and that they were approachable. Is that right?
Yeah, as far as I remember.
So you felt that if you had any issues, you could raise it with any of them.
If they was on call, yeah.
Any of the duty director.
Yeah.
Anyone working as duty director. But you do say that you felt that if you went to the SMT with an issue, you felt that they might have spoken to others about it as well. Is that right?
All I'm trying to say is that I think there was a lot of gossiping going on in the centre, and whether you was sort of senior management or whether you was an officer, I just didn't feel comfortable sort of parting with information that I felt maybe would sort of go further and someone else might talk about it. So I didn't tend to sort of bring things up. Just keep it to myself.
So if you had concerns about a fellow officer, would that have prevented you from raising them with senior management?
No, that wouldn't have done that.
It
wouldn't have prevented me from speaking
so
to
you
a
still
management. I
still
would have
would
spoken to a manager if I had concerns over another officer. Yeah.
And that never happened?
I didn't have any. No.
No. You also say, just whilst we're still on management, that DCMs were doing the best they could, you felt. You say that a couple of times in your statement. That was your experience when you were a DCO and a DCM?
Yes, it was, yeah.
When you were a DCO, did you have a line manager? Do you remember?
I did, yeah.
Who was that?
Off the top of my head, I believe it was possibly either like Stuart Povey.
Stuart Povey-Meyer.
Sorry?
Stuart Povey-Meyer, is that?
That's right, yeah. I think it was possibly Stuart Povey, possibly DCM Connolly, maybe DCM Ring.
Okay. And did you, what was your relationship like with your line manager?
Fine.
And would they give you actual management? Were there appraisals or performance reviews or anything like that?
I believe I had like reviews carried out periodically. I can't remember how long the reviews were in between, but I believe I had PDR reviews carried out. Okay.
And moving on to the issue of the mental health of detained people and the issue of self-harm, you say, Mr. Thompson, at paragraph 18 of your statement, that some detainees would threaten self-harm just to get what they wanted. Is that right?
Sometimes, yeah.
How did you know that that's why they were threatening self-harm?
Sorry, can you...
Yeah, so you say they were threatening self-harm to get what they wanted. How did you know that was the reason they were doing it?
Well, for example, they'd say it because that maybe they wanted to speak to someone from the Home Office, and it'll be if I don't get to speak to someone from the Home Office, I'm going to hurt myself and things like that. So.
And what would you do if you didn't think that there was a genuine threat to self-harm then?
If I didn't think...
So someone says, I'm going to self-harm or something like that. Are you then assessing whether you think it's a genuine threat to self-harm or not?
Well, yeah. You've got to just like trying to ascertain if they're actually, if they're taking it, if they're being serious or not over it.
And what's the action you take if you think it's a genuine threat? If you think they are being serious?
If they are being serious, then I'd want to raise an ACDT.
Okay. And if they aren't, if you don't think they're being serious?
If I don't think they're being serious, I may even still put them on an ACDT just because they even said it.
Would you always do it if they said it?
I think it would just really depend on the situation at the time and who you're talking to and sort of gauging them.
Okay. One of the things you say, and I realise I'm jumping around your statement a bit, but paragraph 134 is that individuals who self-harmed or said they were depressed or wanted to hurt themselves were seen by healthcare and spoken to in a review and placed on an ACDT or even constant watch. Would you be referring them to healthcare in that scenario?
Sorry, can you just repeat that again?
Yeah. So one of the things you say is that individuals who self-harm or say they're depressed or wanted to hurt themselves were seen by healthcare, spoken to in a review and placed on an ACDT. Is that right?
It's probably maybe the other way, like you'd refer them, you'd open up like an ACDT,
yeah,
and then they would be reviewed and seen by as best as I remember, healthcare, and a DCM would be present, and then they'd do a review with the detainee.
Okay, so it's not you directly contacting healthcare, you open the ACDT and they learn about it and there's a review carried out, is that right?
Yeah, no, you'd open up the ACDT first and then there was like a process that would get followed.
Okay. And one of the things you say in your statement is that you think it would have been helpful to have more training on how to deal with acts of self-harm, the reasons why people did it, and the ways to help people not to self-harm, is that right?
Yeah.
And I think you say in your statement that you don't recall receiving any training around mental health, is that right?
Yeah, I don't remember any training on mental health.
Did you ever ask for any training on that?
No, not personally, I don't remember that, no.
So, I mean, for example, we've heard evidence about a number of detainees who had PTSD. Have you had any training on how to deal with people with PTSD?
Not as far as I'm aware, no.
And did you, when you were being trained both in your introductory course and also your refreshers on use of force, was there any training about particular considerations to take into account when using force against someone with mental health problems?
Not as far as I remember.
Okay. Coming on to a couple of questions just about staffing levels. You say broadly at paragraph 76 that you didn't have enough staff for the work. Is that right?
I think in general, yeah. I think we was, you get quite short-staffed at times. There were times when we had enough staff on, particular days, but there were quite a few times when we were short-staffed.
Was that something that you and your colleagues would talk about?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And you say at paragraphs 78 to 80 of your statement that short staffing had a big impact on detainees. And so you give an example of it meant they couldn't go outside to get fresh air on occasions. Is that right?
Yeah.
Was that the activities staff that would be responsible for letting them go outside, or would you be responsible as well?
Well, we ended up actually having to monitor, like an officer on the wing would end up having to actually monitor the courtyard. I can't remember what used to happen before that. I don't think there was no officer that used to monitor the courtyards. I believe activities would open up the courtyards for detainees to access them for exercise or sport or whichever, and then they'd just be left to their own devices throughout the day until lock-up. And then there'd become a point where DCOs were then having to monitor the courtyards. So, for example, if you only had 3 staff on duty, on the wing at the time, then one of you would, you'd do it in, spend an hour and go and monitor the courtyard and stand out there. So then you're short-staffed.
And in terms of going out to the courtyard, would it be done wing at a time?
Excuse me?
Would it be done one wing at a time in terms of going out to the courtyard?
No, I mean the courtyards would all be open to all the wings, but it's just that there was a time where DCOs then had to stand outside and monitor the courtyards.
And was there ever days where detainees weren't able to go outside at all?
I think so, yeah, because there might not have been enough staff or for someone to actually go and stand there and keep the courtyard open.
And did you see that as a big deal?
Yeah, because you should be able to go out and get fresh air. You should be allowed to go and exercise.
Do you think? Sorry.
I was just saying you should be allowed to go out and spend time with your friends and people that you've met in there. So yeah, you should be allowed to go out. Yeah.
Do you think managers saw it as a big deal?
I'd like to think so. I think it's quite an important situation. People need to get out and get some fresh air. But I'm not a senior manager, so I wouldn't be involved in any of those conversations.
Okay. When you were a DCM for those 4 months or 5 months or so, you said that you found yourself on occasion covering all 5 wings as DCM. Is that right?
It should be 4. Because I included with that B wing, but it was B wing. I was normally working as a DCO, but I have covered 4 wings. Wasn't every sort of shift, but there were occasions when that was the case. And
was that something you could actually physically do?
It took a lot of effort, but you just going from one end of the centre to the other and dealing with issues constantly through the day. But I managed to keep up and managed to get down there and check the wing diaries and sign them off if need be, and check the workers had been paid, for example.
Okay. I want to come on to ask you a few questions about some comments you recorded us making. First of all, on the 5th of June, if we could have up on screen, sign up at TRN 0000080 at page 2, please. Mr. Thompson, this is this is the transcript of a recording of a conversation between you and some others, mostly between you and a detained person. Obviously, Callum Tully was there as well.
Yeah.
I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just to take some of your comments. It says at the top, don't talk about me. This is you saying, don't talk about me because you're worried. The detainee says, you're actually sick. You say, I know, mate, the day I'm fucking worried about you, so I might as well pack it in. Do what? Inaudible, then do one. Then a few lines down, you say, well, fucking do it on your own then. This is line 17. Well, fucking do it on your own then. I don't want to do it. Stop whining. A couple of lines down, you say, you're whining like a fucking girl. Then a couple of lines down, you say, it's dumb, innit, moaning, man up. A couple of lines down, you say, that's because I don't listen to your fucking bollocks. And then the detainee says to you that you're a prick and says that you're racist and EDL and a fucking dickhead. Now, you were asked about this and you explained it in your statement, Mr. Thompson, as being a conversation that arose because the detained person had demanded new boxers, even though he'd been given clothing. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you say that he then became abusive. Looking back at that, do you think that that justified your comments towards him?
No, I totally regret those comments that I made on that day. Totally regret them. Sometimes you just get so frustrated and so stressed out. You know, even first, like as soon as you walk into the building, maybe I'd had a bad shift before that, and then I'd come in, or maybe I'd had a bad night. But I totally regret saying that. Wished I hadn't said those comments.
Do you think that? How often do you think you made comments like this to detained people?
I don't think I made them all that often. I think it just, when you just got so stressed and you just got so sort of anxious and being under pressure, I think you just, you know, with your frustrations, I think it just ends up sort of spilling out of you.
And you say in your statement that it was important to stand your ground with detained people who were being abusive and threatening. Do you accept that this is going beyond standing your ground?
I think I probably went over the line there. It's a bit difficult. It's quite difficult sometimes. You're just trying to maintain that line or that boundary. I think maybe on the odd occasion I might have overstepped that line. And as I say, I apologise for my comments that I've made on that occasion. Yes.
Because the background you've given to this is that this was someone asking for boxer shorts who'd already been given clothing. I mean, do you see that, or did you see that it might be quite humiliating for a detained person to have to be at the mercy of officers to get underwear?
I think so, yeah. I think it could be.
Do you think you had that awareness at the time of that sort of power dynamic, that there were these people that had to ask you for underwear?
Sorry, say?
Did you see at the time that there was this power dynamic, I'll call it, which detained people had to ask officers for underwear?
They didn't necessarily have to ask for underwear. They would normally have to put in a request form for destitute clothing. So it wasn't normally the right thing to come in and sort of ask or request or whatever actual clothing, because there was a particular process to follow.
But I suppose, sort of taking a step back, there's a group of officers who you're choosing to be there, you're coming in every day, you're getting paid, and there's this group of detained people that don't choose to be there and that have to make a written request or a verbal request to get underwear. It's quite a difference, isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you think you were conscious of that at the time?
I don't think I was, no.
Okay. And you would accept, I think, that based on what you've just said, that even if he was being abusive towards you, it doesn't justify you saying that that he was whining like a fucking girl.
No.
And one of the things we've heard from a few other witnesses, Mr. Thompson, is about what people have described as a masculine culture, a macho culture, and staff described being told by fellow officers to sort of man up. Did you see there being a macho culture at Brook House?
Not particularly from my point of view.
Because you're calling him a fucking girl and then telling him to man up here. Do you think that might have contributed to a macho culture?
It's possible, yeah.
If we can turn to page 4 of this document, please, Zainab. This is a brief record of a chat between you and Callum Tully soon after this, and talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
Callum Tully asks you whether you made a new friend. You say, I thought your lot were doing quite well on your own. And then you say, he's fucking doing my head in, cunt. and then you say fucking, you can't even speak fucking spell. Do you think describing a detained person as a cunt was appropriate?
Absolutely not. No, I regret to say that, and I'm sorry about that.
And was that sort of language between staff, was that pretty normal? Because we've heard some staff say that words like cunt were
That was
pretty
quite a
normal.
that's quite a dominant sort of word or saying in Brook House. There was a lot of swearing that used to go on there, and sometimes that was how you communicated, because in some cases that was how, you know, you'd be able to speak to somebody. It wasn't something that happened all the time with regards to like the swearing, but those sort of words were used quite a lot, and I think I ended up just adopting, you know, it just happened so often that I think I just ended up adopting some of those words, which I regret doing.
And when you're describing detained people as a cunt, do you think that can lead to you dehumanising them as well? Do you think it affected the way that you perceived them?
Possibly.
Okay. The same day, Callum Tully made a video diary. I think you've seen the transcript of it. This is whilst he was recording, he'd be interviewed to camera at the end of each day. I'm not going to go to the document. I just want to put some of the quotes to you. The reference for the record is TRN 0000063. And Callum Tully described you, and you've seen this, as having a short fuse, as having lost your temper, and also as being extremely efficient and working hard, but that when the stress of the job got to you, you took it out on detainees. Do you think this is an example of that?
I don't think that's completely right with what he says. I think sometimes you just become so stressed and frustrated that you maybe end up just losing your patience with it all. You know, when you're sort of dealing with the verbal abuse and some of the intimidation and the threats every day, it sort of just gets on top of you, and you just begin to have you've had enough of it. So,
but this was an example of you losing
Yeah.
your temper, yeah.
Yeah.
Would you accept that? Okay.
Yes.
And one of the other things that he suggested was that you would jump at the opportunity to get involved in conflict.
No.
Do you accept that?
No, I don't. No.
Okay. Zainab, if we could have up on screen TRN 0000081, please. Page 6, please. This is the next day, and let me just check that I'm at the right page. 1 second. Yeah, I think I am. Sorry, I'm just finding the... I've obviously given myself the wrong reference, but there's a passage, I'm sure it's somewhere, and it was put to you, where you were talking to Callum Tully and you're saying that, describing that interaction, and you say you're moaning that you're being detained, well fucking stop getting detained. Do you remember that?
I don't remember the conversation as such, but...
You remember being asked about it though, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you say in your statement at paragraph 149 that what you meant by that is that the detainee should sort himself out and get his immigration case sorted. Is that right?
Yeah.
How could he get his immigration case sorted?
By if he putting a request in to speak to the Home Office, or get himself some legal advice from the solicitor, and seeing if there's any way that maybe he could prompt, getting a response about his case and being in Brook House.
I mean, you were there for 3 years, and your experience was, did you think that detained people were themselves to blame for being detained?
No.
I mean, in your experience, could they... Was the fact that they were being detained due to a lack of effort on their part to sort their case out?
No, I don't think so.
I mean, because we've heard a lot of evidence from detainees who said that all they did a lot of the time was try to speak to the Home Office, try to get their case sorted out. Was that your experience?
Yeah.
Yeah. So fucking stop getting detained is not really very fair, is it?
I regret saying that, yeah.
Okay.
I do.
If we can turn to page 8 in this document, please. Hopefully I've got the right page. No, I've got the wrong page again. Just give me 1 second, sorry. Just checking this is TRN 81. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Just 1 second, sorry. We could try page 7, possibly. That's a separate one, but I'll ask you about the comment anyway, and we can find the reference later if necessary. There's a transcript that refers to you talking about a detained person on drugs, and you say, "Mate, fucking look at you, fuck me, drugs, wanker, drugs, fucking idiot, drugs, drugs, drugs," and you've said at paragraph 152 of your witness statement that you don't consider it was inappropriate to talk about detainees and drugs in this way. Is that right? Oh yeah, I've got it there.
Those, I believe those comments when I was saying, "What's the matter with you?" Were actually out of concern, because I was probably surprised to see someone that had they were using drugs of some description. So that's probably just out of concern, and I would have probably advised and said to him, you need to go and do something, go and get something to eat or something to drink. Or
I think it's up on screen. This is a conversation between you and Callum Tully, and you're describing someone on drugs. And for example, at line 216, you say, "Fuck me, drugs, wanker, drugs." 218, yeah, fucking idiot, drugs, drugs, drugs. Now I know you said in your statement, Mr. Thompson, that you were concerned about people being on drugs, and that's where this comes from. Is that right?
yeah, I think that was when I was looking at the board. It had all the names on. You see, it was on B wing, and I think I was pointing out where the drug people using drugs or possibly even dealing them were in the wing.
And did you see people who were using drugs at Brook House as fucking idiots?
Because I didn't think that they should be taking and using the spice and the different drugs that were in the centre.
Did you have any understanding about why people at Brook House used spice?
Probably as a crutch, probably as an escapism from sort of maybe the realities of having to reside in Brook House.
Okay. And just on the issue of spice, was there any set protocol or process for responding to spice attacks?
Healthcare. There'd be a first response or a call. Someone's having a bad attack on spice. Get healthcare to attend as quick as possible. And in some cases, they were taken to hospital. Ambulance called.
So from your perspective, it was just get healthcare, basically. Get
healthcare, put them in a recovery position, make sure they were comfortable until healthcare arrived. Okay,
so for you, it would be put them in a recovery position.
If it needed it, absolutely, yeah. Just making sure that they were comfortable. Yeah.
And did you have any training about spice or drugs or anything like that?
I don't particularly remember any sort of training. There may have been something that might have cropped up in the initial training, but I can't remember exactly.
Was spice a big issue for you as an officer?
Well, yeah, because the drugs, be it whether it was spice or any other drug, used to cause issues with detainees in the centre. So it was quite important to try and deal with.
Okay. If we can have up on screen, please, TRN 0000083 at page 2, please. This is a conversation, a record of a conversation between you and Dan Small and Callum Tully. And talking about a detained person, and although it's redacted, at the top there's a discussion about this detained person's criminal record. And you describe him as a horrible bastard. You say that he put his chin out. This is paragraphs 20, lines 20 to 21. You say he put his chin out and wanted you to fucking dig him. That's 23. And you say at line 25, yeah, I went, no mate, I said you, I said throw the first one, I said, you throw the first one and I'll fucking put you out of your misery. If you throw the first one, I'll fucking put you out of this office. So it's up to you, mate. Stinking attitude. Did you actually say that to the detained person?
That's what it says in the transcript.
But I know you said that to...
I regret those words. I've seen it in the transcript and that. So if I've said that to the detainee, I apologise and I regret that.
Do you accept that that's threatening someone, saying I'll fucking put you out of your misery?
I think there was probably a bit more of a backstory to it in terms of stuff that had been going on before that. And with the detainee, I'm not sure how long he'd been on the wing or whatever, but there was probably a backstory to it.
Regardless of that, though, Mr. Thompson, you say that you'd never, in your statement, that you'd never threaten a detainee. You say that in paragraph 161, but, but this is threatening, isn't it?
If I was gonna be assaulted,
that you would fucking put you out of your misery.
I was just standing up for myself, because that's the sort of thing that sometimes you just come across. People are threatening to assault you or threatening you.
Sure.
And again, at that time, I've most likely lost my patience and said it out of frustration and stress.
Well, this is just a conversation between you and Callum Tully and Dan Small, though. Yeah. And I appreciate that you're saying that, you know, if you were defending yourself or standing your ground, but it's not quite far beyond saying, you know, that you'd punch somebody back or you'd even push them or use proportionate force. I'll fucking put you out of your misery is pretty extreme, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. And it goes beyond standing your ground. Do you accept that? Or it would have if it had happened, yeah. Some other comments on the same day, at page 15 to 16 of this, please. Actually, before we do that, if we can just... oh no, we're fine here. Page 15, 16. This is part of a conversation between you and Callum Tully about detained people, and you're saying at the top that it's just a game to them. So, and then you say they come to whatever country, they go to whatever country. It doesn't matter where. Go to whatever country. They don't want to come here legally. They want to do it illegally, under a lorry, back of a bus, whatever. And they arrive here, they get away with doing work, getting paid cash, paying no taxes, mate. You know all of this sort of stuff. Then you say it's just a game. They get caught, they come in here, they get sent back, they come back again. Why? Because everything's here. They don't have this sort of shit going on over there in Albania or Poland. You say they don't have this great, amazing benefit system. And then you say, so they come over here, it's incredible. And you talk about something about someone getting a maisonette. If we can turn over to the next page, please. You say, I'm not really that bothered. You know, if people want to come and live here, so be it. I really don't give a shit. But actually, back over to the previous page, sorry, at the bottom. Line 613, you say, when they come over here and they want this and they want that, it's like, hold on, how about we fucking look after and sort out, you know, our own kids first? Sort out our own fucking boys and girls. You were asked about this in your statement, Mr. Thompson, and you say that this view that you were expressing here didn't affect you in your role at Brook House, is that right?
Yeah.
Did you see the people who were detained at Brook House as having come to the UK for the benefit system?
Some of the detainees actually told us that what happened. That's what they did. Some detainees had said to me that they'd come to the country, they work and then send the money back home, and they said that that's what they did and that's what happened.
Was that your... well, that's working and sending the money home is different from coming over here and using the benefit system, isn't it?
Yeah.
Did you see that as being what most of the detainees at Brook House were doing?
I don't know because I don't know what their situation was, whether they were working or not. It was just sort of like generalised comments. That what they would, you know, they'd be in the United Kingdom and they would, for whatever reason, send in money back, whether that was sort of like work or whatever.
Were you aware that many of the detainees at Brook House were seeking asylum?
I didn't know what some of their situations were.
But you knew, for example, that lots of them were from countries like Afghanistan or other countries where they'd said that they'd fled from. You were aware of that?
Yes, yes.
And did you see that cohort of detainees differently from those who you saw as coming to use the benefit system?
I don't know.
You didn't treat them differently?
No.
Okay. And one of the things you say overall in your statement is that although you've been accused of being racist, and we'll come on some of those accusations in a bit, it doesn't matter to you where people came from. Is that right?
It doesn't, no.
And when you say sort our own fucking boys and girls first, does that not suggest that it does matter to you where people come from?
No.
Before we move on to some of the allegations that were made against you at the time, you may be aware that there's someone who's a witness to the inquiry who's provided the draft witness statement, and I'm just going to read what he says about you and ask you to comment on it. Someone who we know as D180. He says, Darren Thompson was extremely nasty to detainees. He was very confrontational and appeared to really enjoy using force and restraining detainees. He was racist towards the detainees. For example, he would tell people who were applying to stay in the UK that they should just leave and go back to their country. He did not care about our well-being whatsoever, and detainees disliked him. Darren's one of the wing officers who would let people out in the morning and lock people up at night. He then goes on to describe you working at the wing office, and he says, I began buying toiletries with money with friends, which friends and family had sent me, and I made working just so that I didn't have to go to the office to ask Darren for anything. Life was less distressing if I avoided him. What do you say about those allegations?
I think that's inaccurate, and I don't think that's true. And I wouldn't have told him to go back to his own country.
You never said that to
No.
a detainee?
No. I think that's misconstrued.
What do you mean?
Just sometimes when you're having a conversation with a detainee, you're kind of like saying, you'd be talking about something and you could say, well, if things weren't going so well for you in the United Kingdom with regards to your case, sometimes you might say, have you considered that you can return to your home country? And I think sometimes when you're having conversations, and myself included, and different cultures, you could sometimes maybe misconstrue what some things that are said. I wouldn't have said that. He'd go back to his own country, no.
So you never said that in
No.
sort of anger?
No.
Or as a,
No.
go back to your own fucking country or anything
No.
like that?
No.
Okay. Now, I want to come on to ask you, Mr. Thompson, about some of the complaints that were made against you during your employment. Not going to ask you about all of them. I think there were 13 complaints in total, but you've addressed each of them in your witness statement. Before we get into the detail of some of them, do you have any view now, with all of these having been put to you, why you were the subject of so many complaints?
I think probably mainly because I would stand up and I would follow and try and adhere to the centre rules. And I think that maybe detainees didn't like sometimes what I might say, in terms that maybe they weren't allowed to have something or they weren't allowed to do something. And I think that's where it all sort of comes from.
Do you think that on reflection and given some of the recordings we've been talking about, do you think that your own behaviour was at all to blame for the number of complaints you got?
I don't think so, not for those complaints, no.
Okay.
They was all found to be unsubstantiated by one.
Mm-hmm. At any stage during the 3 years of your employment, did anyone from the Home Office or G4S ever discuss with you the fact of the complaints in their totality. So rather than asking you about any specific complaint, saying, you know, Mr. Thompson, you know, taking a step back here, we've looked at this and you've been subject to 13 complaints over the last 2 years. Did you ever have any conversation like that?
No.
Were you conscious at the time that you just kept on being subject to complaints?
No, not really, because I think when I look at it, if there was 13 complaints over like a 3-year period, I wasn't particularly concerned, but then I didn't know how many complaints. I wasn't keeping count of them, and I didn't know that a complaint had been sort of put in against me until a manager or the DCM Edwards, Conway Edwards, would come and advise me of it and say that he wanted to speak to me and investigate the complaint.
One of the things you say at the beginning of your witness statement is that you would try in your employment to build a working relationship with detained people.
Yeah.
Do you think that the volume of complaints suggests that that wasn't successful?
No.
You don't think that?
I think I've built some very good relationships with a lot of detainees in the centre, especially where I was working on A and B wing.
But do you think that there was also a group of detainees who you weren't successful in building that relationship with?
I think with the detainees, even the detainees that had put complaints in against me, I'd still had built decent kind of working relationships with them. And I think perhaps there was just occasions where things might have just gotten to a point where they didn't like something, and at that particular point they put a complaint in against me for whichever reasons.
Okay. I'm going to ask you briefly about some of the complaints before 2017, before the relevant period, because although we're not concerned with the detail of those, we are concerned with the broad issues as a context. So you deal with these from paragraph 168 of your witness statement. And first of all, there is an allegation from, or a complaint from someone we know as D1985 in October 2015 that you were abusing and threatening him and that you treat detainees like the worst scum on earth. What do you say about that?
I think that's false. I don't know anything about that, actually. I've done the statement and everything, but I've got nothing to say about it. It was found to be unsubstantiated.
Do you have any idea why someone would say that you were abusing and threatening them?
No.
In this complaint, there was also some other residents that signed a petition.
Yeah.
And it was noted in the outcome that some of those who signed the petition said that they didn't have a problem with you. Is that right?
Yeah.
And it was also noted that D1985 himself admitted using abusive language.
Yeah.
Given what we've seen in a couple of the recordings, do you think it's possible that you did respond in the same type of way as you did in that recording by saying, you know, calling him a cunt or saying anything like that?
Well, I haven't done that with this alleged with this complaint.
Okay.
So I haven't really got anything much more to say to it apart from it was investigated and it was found to be unsubstantiated. I haven't done anything.
Okay. The next one, at paragraph 169, you deal with it, is an allegation from D4277 in February 2016. He alleges that you were racist and had said to him to go back to his country. Do you accept that?
No, that's false. Never said that.
And that's, of course, the same allegation that's made by D180 to this inquiry. Any idea why two detainees would allege that you made exactly the same comment?
No.
You're sure that you never said it to someone in anger?
Said what in anger?
Said go back to your fucking country or anything like that?
No, definitely not.
Paragraph 171 of your statement is an allegation from D4049 in September 2016 that you asked him questions in an argumentative tone, made a racist comment and swore at him. I think you accept in your statement, Mr. Thompson, that you asked D4049 what he was looking at. Is that right?
I believe he was just kept staring at me. He just kept looking at me from where the fax machine was into the office, and I wondered what the issue was.
And you note that a staff member from chaplaincy said that she'd observed a heated conversation. Do you accept there was a heated conversation?
I don't remember it, but I'll accept that. If that's right.
And what about swearing at him? Do you think you might have sworn at him?
I don't know.
And one of the allegations was that you said, "You lot think you're big man." Do you think that's something you might have said?
I don't recollect what that means, or I don't recollect even saying that.
Okay. Now I want to come on to some of the complaints that were made about you during the relevant period. Firstly, in relation to a complaint made by D381. If we can have up on screen CGS 001443, please. Now, I'm not going to go through each page of this, but in summary, this complaint was that you discriminated against Black or Caribbean detained people, that you got very aggressive and behaved like you owned Brook House, that your conduct appeared as if you wanted to fight detainees and were never in the wrong, that you behaved aggressively and were cocky, particularly when D381 asked for a curtain. And it also notes at page 5 that the complaint was signed by some others as well. I think it's at the bottom of page 5. Yeah. What do you say, Mr. Thompson, in response to those allegations that you discriminated against Black Caribbean detainees firstly?
That's false.
It's false. Do you accept that you behaved aggressively towards detained people?
No, that's false.
And do you accept that your conduct might have appeared as if you wanted to fight detainees?
I don't want to fight detainees, it's false.
Well, we've already seen a recording of you saying, "Throw the first one and I'll fucking put you out of your misery." Do you think you might have made that sort of comment to someone?
No.
In your statement, Mr. Thompson, you deal with this at paragraph 175.
Yeah.
You say that you don't recall the incident with D381, but you told Conway Edwards when he investigated that you'd been asked for a curtain and that you'd said there were no curtains on D-Wing. Is that right?
Yes, sir. I believe the detainee was diversity orderly. So he'd been coming over to Bravo Wing. If he needed any form of curtain of any description, he'd be able to speak to his own wing officer on his own wing for that sort of thing.
Why were people coming onto your wing and asking for curtains if they could get them from their own?
I don't know. Maybe just because they actually needed a curtain, but they weren't being provided with one on their own wing, or maybe it was just a ploy to try and get onto the wing for some other reason.
Okay, and if we can turn to page 10 of this document, please. This is part of the outcome letter from Conway Edwards, who investigated this, and he concludes that the allegation was unsubstantiated, and he notes that you'd told the detainee that there were no curtains, you'd explained that you treat everyone with respect and dignity, you felt that you were pretty good at diffusing situations, and that you didn't have any issues with nationality or race. Is that right?
Yeah.
Do you think, looking back, that you were good at diffusing situations?
I think so, yeah.
Do you think that you treated everyone with respect and dignity?
As best as I could, yes, absolutely.
But not everyone, right? Because you've accepted that there were a couple of times where you lost your temper.
Yes.
Okay.
Accept that.
If we can turn to a different document, TRN 0000080, please. At page 16, please. So this is a record of a conversation on the 5th of June, bearing in mind the complaint that was made that we're talking about was made the next day on the 6th of June. And this is a discussion that you weren't a part of, but it is partly about you. and it says I'm just going to summarise some of what it says, but it's a conversation between Dan Lake, Dan Small and Callum Tully. And there's a discussion about you having responded to someone pulling a curtain. Dan Lake says, geezer come in from C-Wing, he's pulling a curtain, and Darren just had a go at him like you wouldn't believe. And Dan Small says, you could either tell him, okay, I'll get you a curtain from the spare room that we have, or, no, we don't have any, I'm afraid. But Darren, he's losing the plot, man. Callum Tully says, who is this? D381, so it appears that it's talking about the same gentleman that made the complaint against you. Dan Lake says about you, he went nuts. He went, you ain't fucking having one there for this week. Dan Lake then describes it as so extreme. Dan Small then describes an occasion where a detainee was looking at you and you responded saying, do you want to kiss me or something? Dan Lake then describes you as a fucking nutter and says that you completely lost the plot. Describes you as a raving nutter. And then at the bottom of the page, Dan Small says what he does, he will argue with them and then bin them off. And Dan Lake says, yeah, definitely, he winds them up and then sends them out. What do you say in relation to these comments?
I don't know I don't know what to say. That's their sort of their opinions by the looks of it, but I don't recollect saying any of that.
So the complaint that we're dealing with is D381 asking for a curtain, and you responding to it, and then him complaining about your response to it. This suggests, Dan Lake is suggesting here, that in response to being asked for a curtain, you went fucking nuts and said you ain't fucking having one. Is it possible that that's what you said in response?
I don't think so, no.
Do you remember if other people were around when D381 asked you for the curtain?
I don't remember.
Do you accept that if Dan Lake is giving an accurate account here where he says that you went nuts and said you ain't fucking having one, do you accept that would have been an inappropriate way to respond to a request for a curtain?
If that was the case, yes.
Yeah. And just on this issue, in terms of asking for a curtain, what were curtains used for?
They were the toilet curtains, or curtains that would go up on the windows.
And did you see at the time that having to ask for a curtain to hide yourself going to the toilet might be quite a demeaning thing to have to ask for?
I don't think they looked at it. I don't think anyone looked at it as demeaning. It's just the fact that they needed a curtain. But a lot of the times the curtains would get removed and go elsewhere, and then you wouldn't even be able to find curtains within the centre. So therefore, you'd have to. What could you do if you've got no curtains? There's nothing that you can do about it. So I could imagine it would be quite a frustrating thing when you want to use the lavatory.
Because if someone didn't have a curtain, if, as you say, it had been taken and there weren't any, it would mean presumably that they had to go to the toilet in front of someone else.
If they were in the same room at the time, yeah.
Yeah, because there weren't just public toilets or anything that they could use, were there?
No, there wasn't. The toilets were in each of the rooms.
Yeah. And do you accept that having to go to the toilet in your room in front of somebody else without a curtain would be pretty demeaning?
Yeah, I would have. Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
Did you have sympathy for people having to ask
Absolutely.
for curtains?
Yeah, no. I mean, the curtains, everything should have been in there, which is what they were at the time. When we first opened up and we first started using B-Wing as the induction wing, everything was in there. Everything was in place. But slowly over time, bits and pieces would eventually disappear, and the curtains would disappear. So then you'd chase around or try and see if you could order some more and replace them.
We've heard some evidence over the last couple of weeks and also in November from former detainees who talk about having to go to the toilet in front of their roommates as being one of the worst things that they had to experience at Brook House. Did you appreciate that at the time?
Not until you sort of mention it or talk about it like that. No one's ever sort of brought that up with me or spoken to me about it.
But looking back now, you can accept that would be a pretty demeaning thing to have to do.
Yeah.
Okay, Okay, now I want to ask you about a complaint made by someone who we know as D1538. The complaint, Mr. Thompson, that was made was that the complaint was made in August 2017, and the complaint was that on the 28th of June 2017, an officer had told him that he needed to change his clothes as he looked gay, and then he reacted angrily and was given a written warning for his behaviour. And this officer was later identified as being you. You say in response to this in your statement, Mr. Thompson, that you'd issued a warning to D1538 that day, and you set out the contents of that warning.
Yeah.
And the complaint was eventually investigated by the Professional Standards Unit, who I think interviewed you as part of that.
Yes.
Or I think they might have used the G4S statement for it, but either way, you knew about the investigation. And again, he repeated the allegation that you'd said to him that he looked gay, and said that he also said during that investigation that you pushed him out and pushed his head down.
No.
And he said that he was concerned that other detained people would think he was gay. Did you say to him that he looked gay?
No, absolutely not.
Do you think there's no way you would have said that to
Absolutely
someone?
not. No.
You should have also seen Mr. Thompson, his witness statement to the inquiry, that if we can have up on screen, it's DL 000231. At page 28, please. And then, so this is where he starts talking about the incident at the bottom of that page, on the 28th of June. It says, detention officer told me I wasn't allowed to go to Sea Wing and that I should change my clothes because I look gay. It says I reacted angrily to what he said because I couldn't believe a detention officer would speak to me like that. And then if we go over the page, please. Paragraph 104, he said that you made this comment in front of lots of other detainees and they laughed at him and teased him and mocked him for days after the comment. What do you say to this allegation?
Again, I think that's false and untrue.
Okay. And you say in your statement when talking about this that you would never say a detainee looked gay or that he should change his clothes because he looked gay, and that you didn't push him or push his head down?
No.
Do you have any idea why someone might make a quite specific allegation about a quite specific comment against you?
Maybe he was just making it up because I wouldn't let him access onto the wing.
It's if he was going to make it up, he might make up something a bit stronger than he looked gay, mightn't he?
I can't answer it, but I know I never said that to him.
Okay, you think it was entirely invented, this allegation?
Possibly.
Did you ever say anything like that to any detainee about their sexuality or anything like that?
No.
Okay. Coming on to some complaints that were made by someone who we know as D668. He made a series of complaints, and just to summarise what the complaints were against you, for your reference, Mr. Thompson, you deal with this at paragraphs 183 to 186
I've got it, thank you.
of your statement, but just to summarise the allegations that were made against you, one is that on the 29th of June, you went to his room and told him to take your stuff and get out in a rude manner that shocked him in relation to him being due to be removed. And he also alleges that on the 24th of August, that when he went for a visit with his brother, you asked him rudely to come here, frisked him roughly, told him to shut up, and left him feeling intimidated and humiliated. And he also said that you were racist. What do you say in relation to these allegations, Mr. Thompson?
Again, it's false and it's not accurate.
And you were interviewed by the PSU, I think in late January 2018, after you'd left your employment at Brook House. Yeah. And in summary, your response was that, first of all, in relation to the 29th of June, you wouldn't have spoken to him in the way suggested, but you'd have asked him to go to reception after he'd packed his things, and you say that you conducted the search in the same manner you'd have done on everyone.
Same manner, yeah.
Firm, but not too soft.
Just the regular pat down search. It has to be done firm enough through, like, because they've got their clothes on. They might have like a jumper on or something like that. So you just have to be able to do it so it's not too soft, but it's got to be just, it's got to be enough to be able to feel down the arms and the legs and the torso.
Now, one of the allegations is that you told him to shut up. You say that you'd never have told a detained person to shut up, but we've already seen evidence of you telling a detained person to stop whining like a fucking girl. So are you saying that you'd never tell a detainee to shut up?
He said that I told him to shut up, but I didn't tell him to shut up.
You've never told a detainee to shut up?
I may have done previously, but I didn't tell him to shut up, no.
How can you be so sure of that?
Because that's not something I would have said to him. I just asked him if he could come in and have get his stuff, and he needs to come down to reception.
Okay. You're sure you weren't just denying having said that to protect yourself?
No, I don't think so, no. I didn't say that.
Now, you'll have been aware from the documents provided to you that D668, who we're talking about, gave evidence to this inquiry last year, and he said that you were, he made these allegations again and said that you were racist and behaved differently towards black people and white people. There's obviously been quite a few allegations made against you of racism, Mr. Thompson. Do you have any idea why there might be that number of allegations of racism against you?
No, I don't. No.
When you were interviewed by the PSU, you said, and you quote this in your statement, paragraph 183, you say that the word racist was a loose term that was thrown around in Brook House. Is that right?
Yeah.
So did you experience people calling you racist to your face?
Yeah.
And did you ever reflect on whether these allegations might have anything to them?
Sometimes they would just say it to me because they didn't like what I would have said to them, i.e. if I've said to them that you wasn't allowed to come onto the wing, for example, because that was quite a common thing. Eventually they'd get tired of, sort of keep asking you, and eventually at some point, at some time, sometimes you can be accused of being racist because you wouldn't let them come onto the wing.
And you don't consider yourself to have been racist at all?
No.
Did you ever reflect on whether you needed to change your behaviour at all in this regard?
Not as far as I was aware, no.
Okay. Briefly want to ask you about another complaint. This is in relation to D1399. You deal with this at paragraph 188 of your statement.
Thank you.
And the complaint here is that by D1399 that he'd requested a curtain and you'd been aggressive in response, told him you'd change his wing and that you'd make his life difficult. First of all, you say, Mr. Thompson, at paragraph 189, you say you'd never have said that you'd make his life difficult. Is that right? Do you remember?
I don't even recollect that this incident, but I wouldn't have said that to him. I'd advised him if we had curtains or not, and I believe it was dealt with by the manager. So
this is obviously quite similar to one of the previous allegations, which was about asking you for a curtain and you getting aggressive in response. And in fact, there's a pattern of allegations about you getting aggressive in response to requests. Is that something that you think is fair? Did you get aggressive?
No, I don't think I did.
Do you think you lost your temper easily?
Not easily, no.
On occasion, though?
I would say it's happened on occasion.
How often are we talking? Are we talking once a month, once a year, once a week, once a day?
Maybe once every couple of months. It's very difficult to sort of judge or come up with something like that.
Okay. And the request again this time is for a curtain. Again, that would be for use of the toilet. Yeah. That's
not
why
sure exactly what
it.
if it was a curtain for the toilet or was it a curtain for the window.
So would there also be curtains for the windows as well?
Yeah. So it might not necessarily be curtains for the toilet. We could be talking about he wanted curtains for the window. Again, if they wasn't available or they weren't in the room, I'd go and have a look. You generally go up and have a quick check and go, oh, no, there's no curtains. So you'd either try and take them or put the detainee into another room with curtains, or take the curtains out and put them into the room that he was in.
And the consequence of not having a curtain for the window presumably would be that at 6 a.m. in the summer you might wake up because it would be light. Yeah. So that's something which would be quite a big deal for someone, presumably.
I think so. Yeah. If you didn't want to be woken up in the early hours of the morning because of the light coming through.
And was there a sort of chronic shortage of curtains? Was that an issue?
I don't know if if there was actual shortage of curtains. I think it was just the case that when detainees were moved to another wing, they would sometimes take the curtains with them, but not all the time. So when you went and did your checks on the rooms and had the rooms cleaned out, just that you found that there was, from time to time there was these things missing. So you need to try and replenish them, replace them.
And when people asked you for things like this, do you think you generally responded reasonably to that?
I think so, yeah.
Moving on to a different issue, Mr. Thompson. When you became acting DCM in August 2017, you took on a role for investigating complaints as well, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And was there any issue raised by anyone about your fitness to investigate complaints given the number of complaints against you?
No one said anything to me.
And when you were investigating complaints, did you do so with a completely open mind? Just trying to ascertain what the facts were of each of the complaints that I might have dealt with. Did you feel any pressure, or did you feel completely free to decide one way or another?
Like, was I the one that was making the decisions on?
So, for example, where some of the detainees have given evidence, former detainees have given evidence saying that when they made a complaint, it would just be found to be unsubstantiated. Officers would just back each other up. Did you feel any pressure just to back up other officers?
No.
And we've seen that some of the allegations against you, but also some other allegations before this inquiry, a detained person complains and says that something happened or someone said something, the staff member denies it, and it's one person's word against the other. What approach would you take to investigating a complaint where that was the case?
To get statements from everybody that was sort of like involved in that situation at the time, and try and get an account from everyone that was involved.
And if it is just one person's word against another, would that mean the complaint would be unsubstantiated?
I literally don't remember. I think if ever I did an investigation, I think I would speak to senior manager to get clarification on where to move forward with it.
So you'd seek assistance on how to reach a decision?
Yeah, because I hadn't been doing the job all that long, and not having had any sort of training with regards to investigating and dealing with complaints like that, then I would need to go and, if I remember rightly, I'd go and speak to a senior manager so I knew what sort of direction to take with it.
And we've obviously been over some of the complaints made against you, and obviously some of the complaints that you investigated as well. In your experience, did you think that it was easy for detained people to make complaints?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the process was quite easy and straightforward. That if a detainee wasn't satisfied with something, they could fill out a complaint form, which would be on the wing, or in the library or the welfare centre. They could fill out a complaint form, and then that would go to the Home Office.
Okay. I want to ask a couple of questions about use of force in general. And before we do, Chair, would it be possible just to have a 5-minute break?
Indeed, of course. All right,
And if you could rise for 5 minutes.
Perfect.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Thompson, there's been a request from one of the core participants just if you can take your mask off just for 5 seconds. Is that okay? Sure. Thank you very much. Okay, you can put it back on there.
Okay.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions about use of force in general. Paragraph 94 of your statement, Mr. Thompson, you say that you tried to avoid force in general and that detainees were always given the opportunity to walk of their own accord. Is that right?
Yeah.
In your experience?
Is that in terms of like planned?
Well, either. I mean, you've said that detainees were given the opportunity to walk of their own accord, so presuming that this is situations where detainees were being taken to the CSU or being escorted for removal or things like that, in your experience, detainees were always given the opportunity to walk of their own accord first. Is that right?
That generally, it's generally the case. Like with planned CNRs, it's not often the case if it was sort of like a spontaneous use of force.
And you say that force was always the last resort, and that you tried to avoid using CNR techniques, talking to detainees to calm down the situation first. Is that something you did?
Yeah, CNR was to be used as a last resort. Yeah.
And were there any staff that you perceived as not taking that approach?
Not as far as I'm aware.
Did you ever see a colleague of yours using excessive force or unnecessary force?
I haven't, no.
You've never seen a colleague doing that?
No, I haven't.
Other than in Panorama, presumably?
Other than viewing Panorama.
Yeah. Okay. I want to ask you about an incident involving force used against someone we know as D1020. I'm not going to ask you in detail about it because the incident postdates the relevant period. But at a high level, you say, Mr. Thompson, in your statement at paragraphs 126 and 128, that you used reasonable and necessary force. And in response to the allegation that you put your hands around his neck or throat, you say that you never did that.
Absolutely not.
Did you ever put your hands round a detained person's neck or throat?
No, ever, no.
You filled out a lengthy incident report form about this incident. We've got it in the bundle. I don't need to bring it up, but for the record, it's at INN 000018. And you included in that, Mr. Thompson, that you were verbally abused almost every day and usually threatened in one way or another. Is that right?
Yeah.
What impact did that have on you?
Well, it just sort of chips away at you every day, doesn't it? And eventually you just get to the point where, do you want to continue working there anymore? It's sort of a very different environment to work in at Brook House as opposed to working in a job elsewhere. It just chips away at you, just takes a little bit away from you each time, and then eventually I'd got to the point where I decided to leave.
Did you did it affect the way that you saw detainees? Did you think that the fact that you say you were receiving this verbal abuse and threats from detainees, did that affect the way that you saw them?
Not so much, no. Not the way that I saw them, but it might have been maybe in some of the areas that you've covered where I've said things that I shouldn't have done and I've regretted those. I think not in normal circumstances I probably wouldn't have said those if it was in a different environment.
So so language like describing someone as a cunt or a wanker.
Yeah. It's just my frustration and my stress and my anxiety coming out just because of those situations and having to deal with those things at the time.
Now, after this incident with D1020, you were suspended following this incident, is that right? Is that the only time you were ever suspended after a complaint?
Indeed, yeah. Were
you told, or do you have any idea about why you were suspended this time but never before?
I was never suspended for any of the other complaints that were put towards me.
Yeah.
With this particular incident, I think I was just advised that I was going to be suspended pending an investigation. That was all I got told. I was sort of halfway or trying to write a statement out, and the senior manager told me I had to leave site and I was suspended.
But did it?
That's the only time.
Was that a surprise to you, I suppose, given that you'd
Yeah.
been subject to probably, I think by that time, 12 complaints or something like
Yeah.
that? This time you're suspended.
Yeah.
Did you feel that that had anything to do with? Did you feel that had anything to do with Panorama having been broadcast the month before?
I don't know. I can't answer that. I don't know.
Okay. Paragraphs 74 to 75 of your statement, you say that you don't remember being involved in a disciplinary investigation, and you say that although you were suspended on this occasion, this wasn't a disciplinary investigation. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that as I wasn't aware that it was a disciplinary. If it was like a disciplinary into my own personal conduct, or it was, for me, for as far as I was aware, it was an investigation into a complaint that had been put in by not actually that detainee. It was by another detainee within the wing, and I think they'd put a complaint in for some reason. So the detainee that I had actually dealt with hadn't actually put the complaint in.
But I mean, you were suspended and you were
Yeah.
interviewed
Yes.
about it. So
Yeah.
I mean, if that's not a disciplinary investigation, what is?
I understand the question that you're asking me, but I wasn't aware that it was a disciplinary.
Okay, you were never told it was.
No, I
disciplinary.
didn't.
Okay, and you say that even before being suspended, you felt unsupported, stressed out, and anxious at Brook House. Is that right?
At times, yeah.
And were you already intending to leave before you were suspended?
There was kind of like a build-up, but having been suspended, that was the last straw for myself. I just thought I'd done as much as I could do, and I wanted to leave.
One of the things you say in your statement, Mr. Thompson, is that at paragraph 201, that seeing the Panorama programme made you think about whether Brook House was somewhere where you wanted to work. Why did it have that impact on you?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, you say at paragraph 201
Sure.
that seeing the Panorama programme made you think about whether Brook House was somewhere where you wanted to work. Why did it have that impact on you?
All it was just another thing, it was just sort of like another sort of, it's just something else, so it's just a collective of things, and then what with the Panorama coming up, and then being suspended afterwards for dealing with a situation. For me, it was just the end that I just had enough and I didn't want to work there anymore.
But I want to sort of check, are we talking here about what you saw in the Panorama, so the fact that you saw detained people getting abused?
No,
or
just
is
the
it
fact that we were
consequences of
I'm sorry.
the Panorama?
It's just because it was to do with Brook House, and I'm associated with Brook House, and then all of a sudden it's on the TV. And,
So it's more about the reputational damage.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Did sorry, carry on.
Yeah, and then it just followed on where after being suspended for that incident, that was when I decided that I didn't want to work for Brook House no more.
Did you watch the Panorama programme when it came out?
Not at the beginning. No.
Okay. Do you remember when you watched it?
Yeah, probably a year later, 9 months later.
So you didn't watch it whilst you were still
Not initially,
employed?
no.
Were you not curious as to what was in it?
Well, kind of, but I wasn't. So I just sort of wasn't really interested in watching it at the time.
You knew presumably that some of your colleagues had been shown mistreating detained people, yeah? I
hadn't spoken or seen it, so I didn't know what was on it.
But you knew that some of your colleagues had lost their jobs about it?
I was aware that yeah.
Yeah. And you weren't curious as to what they'd been doing?
No.
Okay. You put your notice in shortly after returning to work in December 2017, is that right?
Yes.
After your suspension?
Yes.
And you say, I'd had enough of Brook House and felt that I could not do more than I had been doing. Do you think, looking back, there's anything more you could have done which might have resulted in fewer complaints being made against you and fewer allegations being made against you?
No.
Okay. That's all my questions for you, Mr. Thompson. Just one final thing. Sorry, when I asked you to remove your mask earlier, the camera was still on me rather than you.
That's
If you're
all right.
able to do it again, that
Sure.
would be appreciated.
Of course.
Maybe just for 10 seconds this
Sure.
time, and perhaps that will be okay. And Chair, if you've got any questions for Mr. Thompson, but hopefully the camera will then go on. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that's great. Thank you. I do just have two brief questions for you, Mr. Thompson. I just want to make sure that I've understood you correctly. When you were temporarily promoted to DCM,
Yes.
and so you then began having a role in terms of investigating complaints. Mr. Livingston asked you some of these questions
Yes,
before.
ma'am.
Did you receive no training whatsoever in how to conduct a complaint investigation?
Not as far as I'm aware, Mum. No, I my shadowing or that form of training was to follow an already sort of established DCM, so I would shadow them.
Okay.
But I don't recollect getting any formal training in what you've just asked me.
Thank you. Do you remember which DCM it was who you shadowed at the time?
Mum, wasn't like one particular,
Okay.
because because the officers would be on a different rota, so maybe I might be with the same DCM for 2 or 3 days,
Okay.
and then a bit later I might be with a different DCM.
So it wasn't consistent
It wasn't-
necessarily.
As far as I recollect, no, it wasn't like, oh, that was a DCM that I would shadow for a full 2 or 3 weeks or whatever
Okay.
the time period was. No.
That's fine. Thank you very much. The other question I wanted to ask you about is you've talked about that on occasion you lost your temper, and you've expressed regret for some of the language
Yes.
that we've heard that you used
Yes, ma'am.
towards detainees. Did you speak to anybody about the fact that you were sometimes losing your temper? Did you speak to your manager? Did you speak to anybody else?
No.
Is there a reason why you didn't do that?
I think it was what we spoke about earlier. I didn't feel that there was somebody that I could go to sort of talk to, and knowing that maybe it would be sort of confidential, because I was just aware that there was a habit of people. Didn't matter what way. Didn't matter if you was a senior manager or a DCO, or it was just that it was an issue with gossip and people always gossiping, and I just didn't want my sort of.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
Yeah.
are you saying that you didn't necessarily have any faith in being able to go to somebody and trusting that that would be
Personally, yeah.
dealt with appropriately?
That's just how I felt about it. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Those are all my questions. Thank you very much. I do understand, Mr. Thompson, it's not an easy experience, but it's been important to hear evidence, so thank you very much for
Thank
coming
you,
this morning.
No, no
Thank
trouble.
you.
Chair, we'll now, if that's okay, take our mid-morning break, long enough for people to get a cup of tea. 15 minutes, can I suggest? I suggest we return at 12 for
That's
Mr.
right.
Bromley.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We have the evidence of Mr. Ryan Bromley.
Thank you.
Yep.
I swear by the Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Please take a seat.
Nice one.
Good morning, Mr. Bromley.
Good
Could
morning.
you give us your full name?
It's Ryan John Bromley.
You should have a folder of documents in front of you, that white folder there. I may
Yep.
refer you to those, or they'll also be shown on that screen that you can see on the left there.
Yep.
So rather than having to turn them all up, you can look at the screen. At tab 1 of that folder in front of you, though, is your witness statement, which you made to the inquiry and you signed on the 2nd of February 2022. That will be adduced in full, please, Chair. The reference for that is SER 000434. What that means is we won't go through everything in your statement today. That's already in your evidence. We'll just focus on some of the key issues. You might just want to have that open, and if I ask you about something you say in your statement, I'll tell you which paragraph it is.
Okay.
If you need to remind yourself, you can. So, Mr. Bromley, you worked at Brook House for 2 different periods of time, is that right?
That's correct.
So there was December 2016 to December 2017, and then you went travelling. You returned in around 2020, and you still work there now.
That's correct.
Have you always been a DCO?
Yeah, I've always been a DCO.
And I understand now you're within the activities team.
Yeah, I'm the gym officer, but that's still a detainee custody officer.
So you're no longer on the wings.
No,
And how does being in the gym compare to being on the wings?
it's a lot different. So obviously, I don't have to. I'm not involved in like lock up. The only time I really go on the wings is to cover breaks.
And are the hours different?
I think there's about a half-hour difference between the start of my shift and the end of the shift
And I understand
compared to officers.
Sorry. I understand you prefer the role that you have now compared to being
Yeah.
on the wings. There was a time after Panorama, but before you left to go travelling, when you were asked to take on a DCM role. Sometime then it must have been between September 2017 and you handing in your notice in November 2017. You cover this at paragraph 5 of your statement, which is on page 2. You describe, you think the reason why you were asked to be a DCM is that you were one of the last experienced officers on the wing. Do you mean you were one of the most experienced people left after Panorama?
Yeah, that's correct.
Did you consider yourself quite experienced at that point?
I was considered. I'd say so compared to what was there at the time.
So you'd worked at Brook House since, as I said, December 2016, so less than a year, and I think some of that would have been the ITC, which is this 8-week course. And I won't give you a date of birth, but you're in your early 20s, I think, weren't you, when Panorama was shown. But you were, compared to other people there, one of the more experienced people left. And was it a permanent move to a DCM role you were offered, or
No.
a temporary?
No, it wasn't permanent.
And can you tell us why you turned that down?
I have no intentions of moving into management.
Why didn't you want to be in management?
I was just happy in my job, and for me, the work-life balance is more important than pay grades.
Did you understand that people would sort of take work home with them if they were DCMs and not so much if they were
Possibly.
DCOs?
I can only speak for the job I've done.
And you also say at paragraph 5, I would have been expected to take on this role for the same salary as I was on as a DCO. Is that right?
That's correct, because I haven't been offered the job.
Do you know why that would have been? So you're kind of acting up as a DCM, but you still get paid as a DCO?
I think just being a more experienced member of staff in the wing would be just organising the wing with the officers that aren't so experienced.
But so you're sort of acting as a DCM, but you're not officially a DCM, so you don't get paid anymore.
Exactly.
I see. You discuss life at Brook House and culture and working conditions in some detail in your statement. I wanted to ask you about something you say at paragraph 29, which is on page 8, under the subheading culture.
Right.
So you discuss the shift work, the shift patterns, and you say that during the relevant period, DCOs were contracted to work 49 hours of shift work per week. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And you say that's usually 8 a.m. till 9 p.m. And that could be 4 days in a row, 1 off, and then 2 on.
Yeah, I believe so.
And then would it be another 1 off, and then it starts again with another 4?
Unfortunately, I can't remember the exact roster we had.
Okay, not to worry. But as I said, 8 a.m. till 9 p.m.
Yeah.
most days. And you say in your statement that on some nights, in fact, you wouldn't leave till midnight.
That could be the case.
What sort of reasons would mean that you'd have to stay that long?
It could be due to a certain resident has a flight. It could be a charter. It could be refusing to look up, so you're required to stay and you can't leave site until that's the case.
So you can't leave unless
No.
everything's done. Yep. Would you be paid for staying late if you had to stay a few extra hours?
No, you'd get time in lieu, so toil.
Yeah. So you'd get time in lieu that you could use at a later date. Would that be, so say you stay until midnight and you're due in at 8 a.m. the next morning. Do you still have to come in at 8 a.m.?
You still have to come in at 8 a.m.
And then at some later point you can use those hours that you've accrued. I see. So you could be quite tired if you had to stay out till midnight and start again at 8?
Possibly.
I suppose it depends how long you have to travel home. You also say that morale was low during the relevant period, and you link this to, in part, staff turnover. So at paragraph 30, which starts with, during the relevant period, I believe that the morale of staff overall was very low. You say, staff turnover was so bad that you almost did not know who you could trust, because at the time there was also a big problem with drugs, and it was difficult to pinpoint where it was getting in from. Does that mean you had some suspicion that there might be staff who were bringing in drugs?
I wouldn't know if it was a suspicion of staff. I just knew there was drugs in the centre.
Why does that relate to the turnover of staff?
It could be, well, there's not too many ways to get, I suppose, drugs into the centre. It's not in the public access. And there's so much staff going into the building. It's not just DCOs. It could be cleaning staff, management.
Visitors are searched, I think, aren't they?
The visitors are searched, is
But
correct.
staff wouldn't be searched regularly. Is that correct?
Not regularly, no.
Occasionally?
Occasionally, yeah.
Do you remember how often, sort of approximately every month or so, you were searched?
Couldn't
Less
give you
than
a
that?
number, to be honest.
Do you remember being searched in?
Yeah, I remember being searched.
But not every day.
No.
Did people talk about suspicions about how the drugs might be getting in among the staff or among the detainees?
I don't remember any certain conversations. I think it was just common knowledge of there is a lot of drugs in the centre. No one has pinpointed where it's coming in at.
Something you say which helped your morale from your statement was working with the same people, so people who you could trust. Would that be DCOs on the wing who you were often working with? Do you tend to sort of be with the same people who were based on the wing for extended periods of time then?
Yeah, back then you used to be given a wing and you that was where you done most of your shifts.
And you say back then, is it different now because you're in the gym, or is it different for all DCOs as far as you know?
I don't know how it is now for the DCOs.
And thinking about your sort of working circle, the people who you saw regularly at work at the time, that was some DCOs. Were there any DCMs who you'd work with regularly, or did they change more often?
They change day to day, but normally there might be 2 managers between 4 or 5 wings.
And do you remember if any of those DCMs were specifically your line manager in 2017?
I have no knowledge, I can't remember.
You also talk about staffing levels. So this is page 18 of your statement, as paragraph 75 to 76. It's under the heading staffing levels. And in summary, you say that during the relevant period, Brook House was extremely understaffed, in your words. You say that there was usually 3 officers on a wing, so that's 3 DCOs per wing. But there were so many control and restraints that in reality there was only 2 people. Was there a particularly high number of control and restraints during the relevant period, such that people kept on being taken off the wing to attend them?
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts why it was so high during this time?
I'm not involved in making decisions, but there could be charters, flights.
You say that due to understaffing, it could be a dangerous place for staff.
I agree.
Would you say it was also potentially dangerous for detained people?
Yeah, you could say that.
And generally, what was the effect of the low staffing levels on morale? What was the effect on the people working day to day when maybe those 2 of you being made to cover a wing of 100 or so people?
If there's just 2 officers on a wing, it could be challenging at times. I mean, like the Dove wing that I worked on, it had 3 floors. So just during look-up times, you've got to look up 3 floors between 2 of you. So just that alone could be challenging.
You talk also about the teams who were used for use of force procedures, and you mention this at paragraph 84, which is page 20. You say it's about a specific question, but I wanted to ask you the general point. The teams that were used for procedures like use of force rarely changed, and so I'd say that my confidence in carrying out procedures such as use of force was not affected by high staff turnover. Just help me with that, teams being rarely changed. Were there some staff who were either volunteering or were more frequently chosen than others to do use of force?
I don't know about the decision making on picking teams. I just know the individuals were 90% of the time the same.
And you don't know about the decisions. Who was it who would select teams?
It'd be the manager in charge of the CNR.
Do you get a call saying you've been chosen?
You'd get a call to go and collect your kit and then go and meet somewhere for a brief.
And you were one of the people who was used more frequently, you say?
Yes.
Do you know why that is?
No.
Did some staff members seem to particularly dislike or maybe like being involved in use of force more than others?
I mean, I can only talk for myself. I'm good, I'm experienced. I wouldn't say I enjoy it because there is no perks to doing CNRs. Everyone's on the same money, it doesn't change because you do CNRs.
You say you're experienced in it, so you've obviously done the same training as everybody else. You experienced because you did it more at Brook House, or was it from your job beforehand that you got the experience? Or?
No, it's just from Brook House.
And you mention at the top of page 24, in relation to a particular use of force incident, often when participating in use of force incidents, you are running on adrenaline and everything can move so quickly. So just thinking about not just this particular example, but generally, so you say you're running on adrenaline, obviously can be quite pressured as a environment and as a moment to act in. When does the adrenaline start to kick in? Is it when it starts? Is it beforehand?
I mean, I can only talk for myself, but for me, the adrenaline starts from the moment that you're told that you're going to be involved.
Yeah.
And my adrenaline is just to make sure I'm focused and with the job in hand. I don't talk about it to others. I normally stay quite quiet during the briefs and even after.
And how does the team generally prepare itself for the moment? So you obviously have a briefing.
Yeah, so you have a briefing, you'll be briefed on the resident's name, his weight, his height, could be previous behaviour, previous convictions, and the condition that the detainee's in now.
Yeah. And you say during these you'd stay quite quiet.
I'd always stay quiet.
You've discussed a number of specific people you were asked about by the inquiry, and one of them is Jan Pashali.
Yeah.
And you say in relation to him, I'll just read it, but it's at page 48. The only knowledge I had of Jan is that he was a big character on E-Wing. I was informed that he had previously worked at HMP Belmarsh before Brook House. He was known to be a very tough guy. The only time I worked with Jan would have been during use of force incidents. So was he one of the people who was also quite frequently picked for use of force
That's
incidents?
correct.
So you'd find yourself on the same team as him relatively frequently?
Possibly, yeah.
Did you have any idea about why he was picked, or?
Just probably because the size of the guy.
I want to ask you now then about a few specific incidents, Mr. Bromley. So as I've said, you've provided a statement which deals with lots of different matters and lots of incidents within it. I want to focus on just a couple. So we have your evidence about the others, we have statements from other people involved, and we have an expert report as well. So I'm not going to take you to each of them. But I do want to ask you about the 4th of May, which is the use of force on D1527 on the 4th of May 2017, and this is covered in your statement at page 25 to 26, so paragraphs 104 to 107. The inquiry is heard before about the events of the 4th of May 2017. So D1527 had jumped onto netting in D-Wing. He'd been persuaded to come off the netting, and 2 other residents went to sit with him. There was a decision then made to relocate him. Your statement says he was going to be relocated to E-Wing, although some of the paperwork says CSU. Were you aware of the netting incident, or were you only involved later?
I have no knowledge on the netting incident now. Obviously, it's 5 years ago. But I know it was the policy, if someone did jump on the netting, it would be possible for them to go down to E-Wing, CSU.
And you say at 104 and 105, and you've just said now, you only have a vague recollection now. Obviously, it was a recollection now, sorry. It was obviously 5 years ago. But the account that you wrote after your involvement would be the most accurate.
That's correct.
And that's because you'd have written it on the same day?
Yeah.
After this incident, or after use of force incidents generally, tell me about how you go and end up writing your report. Do you have your debrief and then write your report?
Yeah, so as a team, you'd all have your debrief, and it's if any injuries are present, you would then be given time away from the wing to write your report, and it has to be done. Back then, it was within 24 hours, but normally you would do it straight after.
And they're typed up, so do you go and use a computer?
They're all typed up now, but back then there was limited computers, so sometimes they might be hand done. But if you could get a computer, you'd do it on a computer.
Yes, you're right. Sorry, some we've seen for the relevant period are filled in by hand and some are typed. So if it is typed and yours is on this occasion, would you have gone to the wing office to use the computer?
I wouldn't have gone to the wing office. I would have gone somewhere quiet, like admin, and just found somewhere quiet.
So somewhere where residents couldn't access a sterile area, is that right?
Yeah, sterile area.
Can we have a look then at the documentation? So if we can have it on the screen, please. It's CJS 005530. It's also at tab 6, Chair, but we'll show it on the screen. So we've seen these before. They have a red cover for the use of force report, and this is obviously the one in relation to D1527. The date's there, 4th of May 2017, and the time is 17:25. It's an unplanned use of force if you scroll down, and the nature of it is handcuffs were applied for 5 minutes to the detainee. Can we go to page 13, please? If we just scroll out so we can see the whole form, thanks. So this is your account. It's got your name there. It's dated 26th of the 4th, 2017, which is obviously wrong. And at the end of it, where you signed it, it's got the correct date. So I'm guessing it's because maybe you've used one that you filled in, and so you don't have to copy your CID number out every time or something like that. But there's no suggestion that you filled this in on the 26th of April. Obviously, the date was after the event on the 4th. You record there, if you scroll down a little, that you're on the left arm. So you've crossed next to left arm. And if we go to page 14 is your written account, as I say, typed up. So starting with that big paragraph there. On May the 4th, 2017, at approximately 17:15 on D-Wing Level 1, myself and DCO Mohammed Shahiyar Shackout were asked by DCM Steve Dix and DCM Michael Yates to wait outside the room, to which DCM Dix had begun verbal communication with detainee D1527, following the detainee coming off the first floor netting. So DCM Michael Yates is sometimes referred to as DCO. I think he was acting up at the time, but in any event, one of those two gentlemen asked you to wait outside the room. And do you think that would have been, in case you're needed, wait outside, but we don't need you inside right now?
Possibly.
Would you have known at this point that they were planning to relocate him to E-Wing?
No, I would have no knowledge on that.
And when you're outside the room, can you see in?
Unfortunately, I can't remember if the door was open or closed.
Reading on, at approximately 17:23, myself and DCO Shackout entered the detainee's room following hearing detainee 1527 aggressively shouting. So about 8 minutes later, although obviously the times are a bit of an estimate, you enter together. And the reason you say here is because you hear shouting. Why would that make you enter a room generally?
Because someone was shouting in an aggressive manner.
Yeah, why would that make
care, so I would have entered the room to see what's going on.
Yep. And you don't say you were called in by one of the DCMs. It looks like, as you say, you hear someone shouting, so you go in to see what's happening. And you say, upon entering, detainee D1527 reached for his right pocket while trying to swallow his phone, to which he didn't succeed, and instead he dropped it onto the floor in the room by mistake. Immediately, D1527 stood up from sitting on the bed in an aggressive manner, with both fists closed, insulting DCM Dix, and then reaching for the phone the second time. So given you say he stood up from sitting on the bed, it sounds from your account like he was sitting on the bed when you entered and then stood up. And from there, he dropped his phone, which he'd been trying to swallow. Now, you say in your statement that he was trying to swallow a phone battery, and in your account it says mobile phone. Can you remember which one was correct?
It would have been the phone battery. Phones are quite hard to swallow.
And then you say he reached for the phone a second time, so it's on the floor and he's reaching for it. And then you say, at this point, DCO Shackout took control on detainee 1527 head, while myself took control of his left arm, and DCM Michael Yates took control of his right arm. Once all locks were applied at approximately 17:26, DCM Dix applied handcuffs on detainee 1527, and then you say you escorted him to E-Wing. So it looks from this that DCO Shackout made the first contact with his head, you on the left arm, Mr. Yates on the right arm. Can you help us with why reaching for his phone would necessitate force being applied to him or him being restrained?
If this detainee's trying to self-harm, and obviously if he's going to try and get a battery in his mouth, the last thing you want him to do is to succeed and actually get the battery in his mouth.
So it's to stop him from...
Yeah.
And can you help us with why the first thing to do might be to take control of the head?
I can't talk for another officer. I was only following my job.
It looks like before this point there'd been no contact between the staff and the detainee. Since you'd entered the room, he was on the bed, you'd entered the room, and then the first contact was to stop him from getting the phone battery, from what you said. DCM Dix's involvement from your account was at the point of applying the handcuffs after the locks had been released. So that's after his arms had been put in the right position and then the handcuffs go on, is that right? And then lastly on this page, the last line of the big paragraph, he complied to a full search once entered, so this is after he's on E-Wing, at approximately 1740. Can I ask you, who would have to decide about whether a detainee can be fully searched?
Upon being relocated?
Yeah.
I believe that's the policy. Once you get relocated, it would be the policy to search him to make sure there's nothing on him that could harm him.
And you conclude at the end, I believe that the force used was proportionate to the seriousness of the situation. And I think you've already sort of told us why you think force was needed. It was...
Yeah, I believe the force was reasonable.
And it was needed to...
It's a duty of care for the detainee's welfare.
To stop him from reaching the phone battery, you said it before. And then just under 15, just to finish off your part of this form, you've circled the left arm. And then at 16... just so there's no doubt about it, you've signed it and dated it, and it is the 4th of the 5th there. So the day it happened, at some point between when it happened and when you went home. Your witness statement also says that you can't comment on the accounts of others. And as I said, that's, as you say, because your account would have been the best recollection you had on the same day it happened. But the reason I'm asking is because we have a number of different accounts. So if we can turn to page 11, please, and you can help us as far as you can with this. This is Mr. Shackout's account of the events. And if we look at that sort of big first paragraph, when we start with Mr., so about halfway down that big paragraph, Mr. 1527 jumping on the netting. So then we get into the incidents in the room. At approximately 17:20 hours, Mr. Dix entered the room where Mr. 1527 was present and advised Mr. 1527 to walk to the E-Wing following his aggressive behaviour. At approximately 17:23, I, DCO Shackout and DCO Bromley entered the room due to the loud aggressive tone Mr. D1527 was using towards DCM Dix. Says that he asked for cooperation, but he wasn't willing to cooperate. Stood up from the bed he was sitting on in an aggressive manner with both fists closed and tried to reach for his right pocket while trying to swallow his phone, which then fell off. Means he dropped it, perhaps. And then goes on to say his name. I took control of Mr. 1527's head inside the room. Officer 2 and 3 then took control of Mr. 1527's right and left arm. As soon as they had locks on, Mr. 1527 was then handcuffed by Steve Dix. So it's quite similar to your account. Mr. Shackout said he took control of the head. It says Officer 2 and 3 took control of the right and left arm. By Officers 2 and 3, would he mean the other 2 officers who were there?
That's correct.
So we know that there was obviously you. Mr. Yates was there, although he's sometimes a DCO and sometimes a DCM in this paperwork. Was there also a third man in the room, do you recall? Mr. Ben Wright, DCO Ben
I have
Wright?
no memory of anyone else.
Is it right to say that if somebody hasn't put hands on a detainee, they don't always fill in a use force form?
Back then, that was the policy. I believe now if you're involved in an incident, you'd have to do at least an incident report.
Even if you just saw it? And then if we go to page 8, please, of the same document. And this is Mr. Dix's account, and the paragraph that starts a short while later, so the second paragraph. I went back, so first he talks about the detainee being on the netting. A short while later, I went back to that room to speak to D1527 about his actions. It says he explained the reasons. I explained due to his behaviour that he would need to comply and go to CSU on Rule 40, and he said no. I explained if he refused, then potentially as a consequence of his actions, force could be used. At this moment, he placed his hands in his pocket, looking like he was trying to access something. I asked him to empty his pockets and remove his hands. He refused to do this. For this reason, I felt fearful for his safety, as he has a history of self-harm, but also fearful for my own safety, so spontaneous force was required to prevent a possible weapon being produced. And then he goes on to say, I, DCM S. Dix, took control of Mr. D1527's right arm, attempted to get it into a backhammer before handing it over to DCO M. Yates once officers came to assist. And then it says, once officers had control of him, DCM Dix placed his left wrist into a handcuff, followed by his right wrist. So he recalls being in the room with D1527. He doesn't mention the shouting that you say you heard from outside. He doesn't mention seeing a phone falling on the floor, or D1527 trying or threatening to swallow a phone. He says that D1527 put his hands in his pockets and refused when asked to empty his pockets, and he didn't know what was in them. And he says that he took control of D1527's right arm and attempted to get it into a backhammer before handing it over to Mr. Yates once officers came to assist. So it sounds from his account that he believed he was the first one to make contact, and then after that had happened, officers came to assist. And obviously you record it differently. You believe that you entered the room before any force was used and the detainee was still on the bed. Finally, on this document, and then I'll ask you about them, page 18, which is Mr. Yates's account. And going about 6 lines down, starting from myself and DCM Steve Dix, agreed to enter the room and speak to Mr. D1527 and ask him to walk with us to Eden Wing as his behaviour was not acceptable. Before entering the room, I asked DCO Bromley and DCO Mohammed Shehayar Shackout to remain outside of the room until otherwise advised. It says that they entered the room. Mr. Dix began talking to the detainee about what had happened. At this point, Mr. D1527 said something along the lines of, "Go and get your friends to get me, I'm not going to go anywhere." At this point, Mr. D1527 put his right hand into his pocket and looked to be reaching for something. It says that Mr. Dix asked what it was, that he responded with, "You'll see what is in my pocket." And then he stood up with his fists clenched and started shouting. DCM Dix then grabbed hold of Mr. D1527's right hand. At this point, DCO Bromley and DCO Shehayar Shackout entered the room and began to restrain Mr. 1527. Goes on to say that DCM Dix later placed cuffs onto Mr. D1527. We released locks and held onto his arm, and we began moving him from the room, but his level of aggression escalated, and DCO Shackout took Mr. D1527's head. So again, in this account, not written by you, nothing about a phone, but something about something being in the pocket and not knowing what it is. And again, DCM Dix making first contact while you were outside the room. It says that you entered the room after Mr. Dix had grabbed hold of D1527. Just on the comment about DCO Shackout taking his head, so took Mr. D1527's head after he was in cuffs. Do you remember DCO Shackout using force on his head after he'd been cuffed, or just from your account before?
I have no knowledge. I can't remember back then, to be honest.
And did you know before the inquiry asked you about it that these different accounts within the same single document existed?
No, this is the first time I've seen other officers' reports.
And
we
do you have?
Wouldn't share.
Sorry.
We normally wouldn't. We wouldn't be sharing reports.
I see. So you don't see the completed use of force document.
No.
You just see your part of it. Do you have any explanation for why you might have these sort of 2 sets of accounts that have 2 different versions of events?
Personally, no. I can only comment on my report and I'd stand by my report.
Okay, and if when you'd entered the room, Mr. Dix already had hold of D1527, you would have recorded that, would you?
That's correct.
And your report says force was used at the point he reached for the phone a second time. If in fact force had been used because he was reaching for a possibly unidentified weapon, he didn't know what it was, you would have recorded that, would you?
I would have recorded that.
And finally, we have D1527's own account. If we can see that on the screen, please. It's DL000144. Page 27 only. So this is from the detainee's statement. Yeah, 27, please. Thanks. At 75, he discusses it. So he says while he was in the another detainee's room, a lot of officers came in. He recalls that it was DCM Steve Dix and Michael Yates who told him he had to go to E-Wing. After a while, Steve Dix asked for other officers to come in, who I understand to be Ryan Bromley, Mohammed Shackout and Ben Wright. And he knows the names after seeing footage. They said I had to go to E-Wing, and I said no. It said that there was no negotiation and no de-escalation. I had my phone in my hand. I think I might have said something like I might swallow it. And then he mentions you grabbing his arm and shoulder, Michael Yates grabbing his other arm and shoulder. And if we go to page 28, he comments at 79, at the bottom, thank you, on the differences between the reports, and says, I remember that DCO Ryan Bromley was the first officer to use force on me. I understand that the reports all say different things. And he says why he thinks you were the first one, because he saw CCTV footage. And over the page, at the top, so as he was the first officer that rushes in the room after Steve Dix, you can see him holding my arm and shoulder. He was definitely the first officer who used force on me. Is there anything about that that jogs your memory or that you think might be accurate compared to what you wrote in your report?
There's nothing that jogs my memory.
Might it be that you used force first and Mr. Shackout took hold of D1527's head after he was in handcuffs?
I have no knowledge on that incident. I can only go by my report that I'm reading.
And you've said at 104 of your own statement, so I'm back to page 25 of your statement. You can take that down now, thank you. At 104, you comment on the detainee and say he was notorious for self-harming.
That's correct.
Did you know about his mental health before you were involved in this incident?
Unfortunately, I'm not a doctor. I didn't know any details. He might have been on an ACDT previously, but he was on Dove Wing for a period of time.
And you mentioned he was on Dove Wing, as in he wasn't always on E-Wing, is that what you said?
I don't know.
And you say you're not a doctor. Just help us with what kind of training, if any, you had in dealing with people with mental issues.
You do a bit of training through the ITC.
Yeah. What sort of stuff?
Be classroom-based, so theory.
About people with mental health problems?
Yeah.
Did you feel like that was enough to help you to deal with the variety of people with mental health issues that you came across?
No.
Why not?
That's why people would go to school to do a degree in that sort of field.
Mm-hmm. Is it something you think would have helped you if you'd have known a bit more? And were you in general aware of detained people in mental distress or with, as you say, with this detainee, high risks of self-harm being moved to E-Wing under Rule 40s?
So can you ask that question again?
Yeah. Were you aware of a process or that it was common for people who are at risk of self-harm being moved to E-Wing under a Rule 40 rather than just moved there?
Quite possibly, because on Eden Wing you had constant supervision rooms.
And they're the ones with the big pane in
Yes,
the
correct.
window. Thank you. I'm going to ask now about another use of force incident. So this is one that involved D390 on the 5th of June 2017, and you discussed this from page 28 onwards of your statement, paragraph 116 onwards. And your account of this is, this is an incident, sorry to jog your memory, 5th of June 2017, a planned control and restraint to remove D390 from his room in order to take him to awaiting escorts. And he had a roommate, D1851, who was in the room with him as well. Your account of this, in summary, was that DCM Povey Myers was the DCM running the use of force. And you say in your statement at 116, about halfway down, if the detainee refuses, the DCM will use verbal communication to reason with the detainee to encourage them to be compliant. I do not recall being in the room at this time, so I couldn't provide further comment on exactly what was said by DCM Povey. And then you were asked to address this in your statement and to mention the report that you made at the time. So we'll have a look at that written report on the screen if we can. It's CJS 005624. And it's at tab 10 as well of the chair's bundle. So that's the front page. If we go to page 2, your name's on there. And your account starts at page 20, so if we could have that on the screen. And these are the things that, some of it's been filled in by you, and some of it I think is what's written on every form. So for example, use of force must only be used when it's reasonable in the circumstances and absolute necessity, no more force than necessary and proportionate to the seriousness of the situation. And it says there that your statement must set out what happened and it must be completely independent of other staff involved in the incident. So you know all this from your training and your practice. And your account is on the next page, starting at page 21. If we look at the sort of big paragraph there that starts with at approximately, so you say you made your way down from the staff room where the brief was being held to the location of the detainee's room, which was on A wing. Once the team arrived at the door of A wing, room 209, DCM Povey had begun to give D390 instructions through the closed door, and immediately noticed D390 repeatedly boiling his kettle in the room with the room's floor already gathering a puddle. D390 continued to ignore instructions given, but moved to face the door of the room. Immediately, the team were instructed to advance into A wing, room 209, with myself and DCO Shadbolt closely following DCO Sayers in. Upon entering, detainee 390 continued to ignore instructions from DCO Sayers. For the safety of the team, DCO Sayers advanced, placing the shield onto detainee 390 chest, placing him onto the bed on the room's left side. And then you say you took control of his arm, and then he was more compliant and walked out. So you say that at the time, D390 was repeatedly boiling a kettle. Do you remember if Mr. Povey Myers would have told you that, or whether you saw it yourself?
We would have been positioned to the side of the door while the manager was giving directions and trying to de-escalate him through the viewing panel on the door. So we wouldn't have actually seen in the room. We can only go off what we're being fed back to us.
So it's a normal room on A wing rather than one of the big rooms with the viewing panel we mentioned. So it's just got a small viewing panel. Okay, and you say that D390 continued to ignore instructions. This is before you've entered the room. So these weren't instructions you were giving to him. You're just setting out.
The manager leading it would have always used his de-escalation skills, as use of force is always the last resort.
And then you say he moved to face the door of the room. Again, as you say, you wouldn't have been able to see in the room at this point, but you would have.
We would have been looking at the manager.
The manager would have told you. And you say the team were given instructions to advance. According to your note, it was you and DCO Shadbolt following DCO Sayers in, so DCO Sayers first and you two behind him. And then, as I've read, upon entering, D390 continued to ignore instructions from DCO Sayers. For the safety of the team, DCO Sayers advanced, placing the shield into his chest. So on entering, further instructions from DCO Sayers, which D390 ignored. Is that right?
Yeah, as a team we entered the room.
Yes, and D390 continued to ignore instructions from DCO Sayers.
From my knowledge, although he wasn't physically fighting us, he was non-compliant.
So you said in your report that he was ignoring instructions from DCO Sayers.
That's non-compliant, yes.
Yeah. We can go to DCO Sayers' account as well. It's at page 26. It is by him, but he also refers to himself as DCO Sayers. So about the 6th line from the bottom, the team led by DCO Sayers on the shield and DCO Shadbolt and Bromley as arm officers entered the room. D390 continued to stand at the far end of the room next to the desk and kettle. D390 didn't listen to me asking him to sit on the bed as I entered the room. I feared that myself and the team could be covered in boiling water. I advanced with the team and placed the shield onto the chest of, and then the next page says D390, placing him onto the bed on the right-hand side of the room. So similar account, DCO says, it says the instruction was to ask him to sit on the bed, which he ignored, advanced and placed the shield onto his chest and placed him onto the bed. So using the same phrase as you, placing the shield onto his chest. I want to show the footage of this now. We have to show it, unfortunately, in closed session, but it is less than 2 minutes long. So if we can go into closed session, and can I have confirmation of when that's been done? Okay, as we can see there, and as you mentioned, you couldn't see into the room yourself before you entered. Only Mr. Povey-Myers can see through there. And he only gives instructions to D390's roommate, doesn't he? It's the only person he's speaking to.
I have no knowledge on that.
And once the doors open, there's no further attempt to speak with either of the men in the room before using force, is there?
No.
Not by DCM Povey-Myers or not by DCO Sayers?
No. The team were told to advance.
So it's literally 2 or 3 seconds before the door opening and D390 being pushed onto the bed with shields.
That's correct, because there's a kettle getting boiled in the room.
Sorry, I didn't catch
There's a
that.
kettle getting boiled in the room.
Do you now accept, having seen this, that DCO Sayers did not give an opportunity to D390 to sit on the bed before using force?
Obviously, it's a long time ago, so I have no memory on that. But if a detainee's boiling the kettle, threatening officers with it, then I don't think that would talking to them. I think they're past that.
So you said in your account, upon entering, detainee 390 continued to ignore instructions from DCO Sayers, and for the safety of the team, DCO Sayers advanced. There wasn't a period where he was ignoring instructions, was there? It was immediate.
He was ignoring Stuart Povey.
But he wasn't ignoring instructions from DCO Sayers.
That's correct.
How did you come to write in your report that he was ignoring instructions from DCO Sayers?
I think because normally, well, when you're the number one officer, you are the voice. So there's only one voice, not to confuse the detainee. So he'll be given instructions once the locks have been applied. It'll be his voice trying to get the detainee to relax, try and comply with us.
So you're saying that Mr. Povey-Myers did the de-escalation outside the room?
Stuart Povey, as you can see on footage, he was doing the de-escalation from the door to try and get this detainee to come to the door compliantly, which the detainee refused to and carried on boiling the kettle.
If we can have CJS 005 624 back up on the screen, please. And page 21. And again, that paragraph at approximately 1700. So where you've said, immediately the team were instructed to advance into A-Wing Room 209 with myself and DCO Shadbolt closely following DCO Sayers. Upon entering, D390 continued to ignore instructions from DCO Sayers. You accept now that he didn't ignore instructions from DCO Sayers. There were no further instructions from DCO Sayers, in fact.
DCO Sayers would have continued to do instructions during the whole incident.
Was there a period when he was giving instructions and D390 ignored him before the shield was applied?
I have no knowledge.
Well,
It's a long time ago, to be honest.
You just watched the footage a couple of seconds ago.
Yeah.
And they immediately enter the room, don't they? And the shield is almost immediately applied to the detainee.
Because there's a boiling kettle in the room.
I'm not asking for why it was, I'm just asking about what you saw in the footage.
Well, I've seen it on the footage, and yes.
Yes. And can you help us with why you might have said in your report that D390 ignored instructions?
No, I must have just been going off what Stuart Povey.
Did you discuss what to write with DCO Sayers?
No.
And the action that we saw in that piece of footage where DCO Sayers uses his shield on D390, you and DCO Sayers both describe as placing a shield onto him. Now that you've watched it again, can you think of a better word to use, or do you stand by the word placing?
I stand by the word.
You wouldn't use a word like pinning him down with the shield? No. Can we take it then in all the reports that we've seen from you where you've said a detainee's been given an opportunity to comply or has ignored instructions, you might be mistaken about that sometimes?
No, during the course of any CNR, de-escalation tactics are always used to try and de-escalate the detainee if he's in an aggressive manner.
But sometimes the ignoring instructions might be before you enter the room, for example, but you might accidentally write that it was after.
Could be human error.
And in all reports where you use a word like place to talk about placing a shield, you could be talking about force of the level that we saw on the footage. So where you've used words like placed,
yeah,
placing a shield, we can imagine that to mean it might be force like you've seen on the footage. So you might use place to describe that sort of level of force.
I can only go off that report, and I stand by placing the shield was the correct term.
You should have seen the report by the inquiry's use of force expert, Mr. Collier, but I'll read out what he says about this event anyway. And Chair, this is from his first report, so INQ 000111. We don't need it on the screen, thank you, but you can leave that one off. It's at paragraph 249. He says, once at the door, There is no clear conversation between DCM Povey-Meyer and D390. Instead, he tries to persuade the second detainee to come to the door and follow the staff. He should have followed this with a further and last opportunity for D390 to walk from the room. No effort was made to open the room door and give D390 a chance to speak with DCM Povey-Meyer face to face. Instead, he opened the door and sent the team in. They immediately pinned D390 and then removed the shield. The events that follow show D390 to be calm and explaining his reasons for not complying with the removal order, and then he concludes at 260-261 that all reasonable efforts had not been made for D390 to comply, force was not used as the last resort, and that initial use of a shield was more than necessary as communication should have taken place first. Do you agree with that?
I mean, John Colloway is the expert. I've never done a manager's job where I'm doing the de-escalation through the door. I was just doing my job as the arm officer on that scenario.
Chair, it's 1 o'clock now. I have some more questions from Mr. Bromley, and rather than put off everyone's lunch until that's done, I suggest we have a break now for lunch, and we'll call him back at 2 o'clock. Unfortunately, this means that you won't be able to speak to anyone about your evidence over the break, but it's just an hour for lunch, and then you can return and carry on. Thank you, Chair. 2
Thank you
o'clock.
very much. Thank you.